Welcome. It's great to see so many of you here. I am here, actually, because of a telephone call. In 2010, I was looking for an expert on water, and Hussein Amory answered my telephone call. He happened to be going to Lebanon at the same time I was going to Lebanon. It's kind of like that star-crossed ferry that he was just talking about. But we were both in the country at the same time. And he explained to me about water politics, which at that time was very important. Syria was going through a drought. And you will hear me argue that the drought actually does play a role in the Syrian uprising. The second reason it's good to be here is because today at lunch I learned that there is an academic discipline here called humanitarian engineering. And for all of you students in the room, do I have a crisis for you? We have a displacement problem in Syria. It is expected to grow to 3 million this year, and the international community doesn't have a clue about how to help these people, how to organize displacement camps. Most of them are living in schools, 20 to a room, and they could use your help. So if any of you need some Skype numbers, I think I can supply them. I'm hoping that there are so many people here because there are a lot of people in this room who drink their coffee out of a Morning Edition mug. It's also good for me to be here because it is rare that I see the people that I talk to. I spend most of my time working along the Turkish border. I'm coming in and out of Syria. I'm reporting mostly on the northern provinces of Syria. It's where the Assad regime has melted away on the ground but still rules the skies. Syria is now the most dangerous beat on earth. We've lost 28 journalists, 28 killed covering this. Some of my colleagues, Austin Tice, is still missing inside Syria. James Foley was kidnapped at Thanksgiving, and we haven't heard a word from him. But many of us, and there are quite a few now who are based in southern Turkey, many of us still cross into the towns and villages to convey how the war is ravaging the country and the people. When I come home, I always get the same question: what's it really like? Well, a lot of it is just plain odd. I'm based in a Turkish resort town, Antakya. It's near the Syrian border, and it's a place that was known as Antioch in ancient times. And it's remarkable because it is the place where the followers of Jesus were called Christians for the first time. And in Antakya, there are restaurants and tourist ATM machines and museums. There are also spies, diplomats, bearded jihadis, and black market arms dealers. There are shops along the back alleys that sell used military uniforms, and you would be surprised to know that there is a brisk business in black headbands with Quranic sayings for the fashionable Islamic militant. Yes, there is a store where you can buy those black headbands. Antakya is a city that is intertwined with Syrian history because, in fact, it was once part of Syria. And many of the inhabitants there actually speak Arabic as well as Turkish. The food feels Arabic, the mood feels Arabic. It is a place that is more like Syria than it is like Turkey. And this province is playing a pivotal role in Syrian history again. This is the place that more than 100,000 refugees have come for shelter. They live in refugee camps that are strung along the border, and these camps have become a place of R&R for the armed rebels. This is where their families are. This is where their families are safe so they can go back in and fight. Also, this is where the middle class in Syria, the business class in Syria have come. You don't need a visa if you're a Syrian to cross the border, so you can just drive into Turkey, you can rent a house or an apartment, and you can wait out the war. This is why the journalists covering Syria hang out in Antakya, in Hatay province, because we have the greatest access to Syria. Now, over the past year, Syrian rebels have liberated large swaths of territory in northern Syria. There are now 4 border crossings that are open along the Turkish frontier. And the one most often crossed by journalists is near a town called Kilis. It's less than a mile from the Syrian border, and all you have to do is take a cab to the frontier. You hand over your passport to a Turkish official, you get a legal stamp that declares you are exiting Turkey, and you step into a lawless land run mostly by armed, bearded men. The Kilis crossing is run by a particular warlord. He is a former cigarette smuggler from the Syrian town of Azaz, who would know more about running a border than a smuggler. He understood early that running a border post would bring him power and would bring him money. It was a vacuum that begged to be filled, and he filled it. He recruited from the refugee camps in Turkey. He found former bureaucrats, school teachers, people who could run a border operation, people who knew how to tuck their shirts in, people who could run computers, and they do. You hand over your passport at this place, and they registered in a computer. I have no idea where those records go. They're using official stamps that were left behind by Syrian bureaucrats. And it was only a couple of months ago that the Syrian army was defeated by a coalition of rebels, but it was the cigarette smuggler who came out on top and now runs this border crossing. And what you see when you go down there is commerce. Commerce has started again. Hundreds of Turkish trucks on the border bringing in tents and blankets and flour and oil, and the rebels even collect customs taxes. These towns and villages in Syria's northern provinces, these are places that life now goes on without the Assad regime for the first time in 40 years. But it's a really brutal life. Mostly it's without electricity. It's often without a whole lot of food or medicine. And almost every day, one of these places is hit by an airstrike, an artillery barrage, even a surface-to-surface missile. That's been the latest weapon that the Assad regime has used on the rebel enclaves in the north. And a particularly brutal weapon. It's called a barrel bomb. And it is just as it appears. It is a barrel filled with nails and jagged pieces of shrapnel. Syrian helicopter pilots dump those barrels on towns, and the shrapnel acts like little tiny flying knives, and it inflicts horrible damage on human flesh. All of these attacks are against civilians. And so it goes in northern Syria. The rebels attack the army, and the army attacks the civilians. What they're trying to do is drive a wedge between the fighting groups and the people who support them in bringing down the regime. They are trying to make the price too high. As we now enter the second year of the war, the fighting has ground actually down into a stalemate. The rebels, backed by a coalition that doesn't exactly want them to win militarily, and they send only enough arms to keep the conflict going, not enough for a victory, means that the armed groups have not been able to deliver a death blow. The regime is armed by the Russians and financed by the Iranians, and they, so far, have been unable to crush the rebels. And so that goes. In Aleppo, which is Syria's largest city, it was once the financial capital of Syria, the fighting has almost stopped completely. The rebels control about 60% of Aleppo, and the regime about 40%, and it's been that way for months, except for a few inches of territory, a few streets that shift back and forth between the regime and the armed groups. So most of the really experienced fighters have actually moved out of Aleppo now. They've gone on to a strategy of attacking military bases to amass more arms to bring the fight even further to the regime. And the rebels who've been left behind have turned mostly to looting and warlordism. And the civilians are simply trying to survive the winter. The good guys, if you can call any of these groups the good guys, turns out to be the radical Islamists. Jabhat al-Nusra. They are considered a terrorist group by the United States, named so just a couple of weeks ago. They share the ideology of al-Qaeda, at least that's what they say on their websites. But some of them have learned quite a bit since they fought the US Army in Iraq. And once again, they have filled another vacuum. What they are doing is they are delivering free bread and fuel to a desperate population. They don't loot, they don't steal, they are professional fighters who are racking up victories against Assad's army. And their Islamic justice in the places that they control are bringing some order to people's lives. The US government does call them terrorists, but many hungry Syrians see them as the best choice of the moment. What I've observed in the 2 years that I have been working on this story is the war has hardened many Syrians. It's radicalized many more. It's forged strange alliances. The Al-Nusra Front is one of them, and it's broken down others. This was a country that once had mixed populations living together. That now is almost impossible to imagine. It's forced people to make some very hard choices, and often what I see is it has made people assume roles that they were neither trained for or prepared for. Half of the refugees are children. A majority of them have lost a family member, and many of them have seen that family member killed. Many of them suffer from acute depression. Most children have not been to school for 2 years. We are now at an astonishing death rate. 60,000 people have died over the last 2 years, 90% of them in 2012. When the Arab Spring first rumbled into Syria, that was in the spring of 2011, it was clear to some of us that this revolt would be different from the other revolutions that were convulsing the Middle East. In Tunisia, Cairo, and then Benghazi, it was so easy to root for those young revolutionaries. And we all reported on those heady scenes in Tahrir or in Libya's Green Square. The narrative was really simple. Collective empowerment was breaking down tyranny. Autocratic power was contestable after all. This idea of Arab exceptionalism, that there was something that was just wrong with Arab society, it was incompatible with democracy, it seemed really rather wrong-headed when you watched what was happening in all of these places. And the means of liberation were so familiar to us. It was about Facebook and Twitter. It was modern. And it was accessible, especially to people who didn't speak Arabic. Back then, US foreign policy was actually quite straightforward. Despite initial reservations from the Obama administration for dumping a partnership that we'd had for 40 years with Hosni Mubarak, President Obama decided that Washington wanted to be, as he said, on the right side of history, on the side that rejected dictatorship, as we were now doing, and embraced democracy. But it turns out that all of these events were actually curtain raisers for Syria. Egypt's important, it's the largest Middle East country, it's a trendsetter, but Syria is the ultimate prize in the region. It's the most strategic country. Syria matters because of its borders and because of its history. It has the potential to reshape the region's geopolitical landscape. So the stakes couldn't be higher and the political implications more complicated. Let's go back and look at how this all began. Syria's revolt didn't begin with young activists swarming a plaza in some Syrian city, but with a particularly horrific torture scene. Teenagers who had their fingernails pulled out by Syrian intelligence operatives for daring to daub revolutionary slogans on a wall in the dusty farming town of Deraa, near the Jordanian border. When their parents came to ask for them, the operatives told the parents to go home and make some more children. And if the husbands weren't capable, then the Syrian police would come to their homes and do the job for them. The abuse and the insult triggered a defiant response. And within days, Al Jazeera, which became a key player in the narrative of this revolt, was broadcasting pictures of a statue of Hafez al-Assad, the president's father, being pulled down. This was a breathtaking replay of events that we had only seen in Baghdad. At the same time, dozens of people lay dead in the street. Now, Syria's official media reported none of this. But Syrian activists turned to Facebook and Twitter. That was the means to spread the news, and Arab satellite channels fired up their coverage to 24/7. Syrians knew that something had changed in their country. Daraa was a particularly interesting place for the revolt to take off. This was a place that actually was filled with loyalists and intelligence operatives. It was on the border, so of course there would be intelligence operatives. It was also a place where there was a highly educated population of young people. Daraa was considered a place that would have been used by the regime to put down trouble in other places. And besides, who came out to the streets to protest in Syria? But there had been a drought. There had been a terrible drought in Syria for the past 5 years. And in Daraa, the crops had dried up and the livestock had died. The government had done very little about it. So Daraa was already on the boil. It just wasn't known in Damascus. There was another part of Syria that was different from the other revolts, and that was there was a news blackout. The regime actually threw the international media out of the country, beat some of them out. They had learned their lessons about propaganda from some of the best, from the Soviet Union and from East Germany. And the Assad regime used propaganda actually quite well. Even from those first days, they formed a narrative that said that this was a revolt of foreigners. This was Al-Qaeda and Washington working together. And as preposterous as that might sound to you, it was resonant with some of Syria's minorities who worried about this majority Sunni population in Syria. It was convincing to Bashar al-Assad's key supporters. He repeats this mantra to this day. If you listen to any of the speeches of Assad, he still talks about it's outsiders, it is not Syrians who are rising up against me. On their side, the young revolutionaries had Facebook and Twitter. Social media was a new tool for them, and YouTube was their propaganda machine. They had smartphones that had cameras, and they were adept at uploading video to disprove the regime's narrative. That battle of the narratives continues to this day. There's another difference in Syria, and that is strategic geography. The revolts along the North African coast in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya challenged recent history. These revolts were about colonialism, about corruption, about economic failure for an educated youth bulge. There's a youth bulge across the Middle East. This is a part of the world where 60% of the population is under 30. This is a population that can't afford to get married and didn't see much of a future. Syria touches on an even older historic timeline. It calls into question so many of the underlying assumptions of the Middle East, rules that were set up following the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It calls into question who rules, what happens with minorities. Is there finally a place for a Kurdish state? Can Sunni Muslims remain the power brokers of the Middle East? And it's a great powers game. Now, just remember the final scenes of Lawrence of Arabia, because they take place in Damascus. Then, as now, a youthful revolt was taking place in the country. The Arabs that fought with Lawrence of Arabia were all in their 20s. It was Lawrence who was the old man of that group, and they were fighting with him, with Western powers, because what they were hoping for was to establish Arab self-determination, perhaps even democracy. And if you remember, as the film comes to a close, rebel fighters are wrapped up with internal petty squabbles in Damascus as the great powers maneuver for the future of Syria. It's that wonderful scene where Lawrence walks away because he knows that the Arabs have been betrayed. Now, a century after the events depicted in that movie, we are back in another Lawrence of Arabia moment in Syria. There's another reason that Syria was different. and made it more brutal, and that was because of institutions. In Egypt, the army quickly sided with the revolution. Now, if you look back, that transition was actually relatively straightforward. The state, Egypt, remained intact. The bureaucracy went to work and continues to function to this day. In fact, the army, you could argue, played a revolutionary role. They were really the ones that eased Mubarak out of office, because in some ways, they had the same gripes as the young revolutionaries on Tahrir Square. They also were paralyzed in the army. Young people in the army were not moving up. So they were not all that unhappy about easing the Muslim Brotherhood in, and they were the most organized group on Tahrir. It was in collusion with the army. Syria has been ruled by one family for 40 years and has no institutions that are separate from a family, a clan, a sect. The Alawites, an offshoot of Shia Islam, about 12% of the population, with a historic inferiority complex. In Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, it is primarily a homogeneous population. Sunni Muslims are ruling Sunni Muslims. There are Coptic Christians in Egypt, a historic minority, and Mubarak used to argue that if the Muslim Brotherhood ever took over, it would be curtains for the Christians. But in Syria, the power of the Assad family is based on minority rule. The country is a mosaic of sects and religions. And the Assads, along with a Ba'athist ideology, put together a secular state, pulled together the minorities, empowered them. The Alawites, the Christians, the Druze. It was a hedge against the majority Sunni population, the people who are at the forefront of the revolution we see today. Syria did have one thing in common with the other revolutions, and I've talked about it a lot because I think it is a very important point to understand the Middle East at this moment in history, and that is they have a youth bulge. And these revolutions, in some ways, are about rising expectations. Syria has the largest youth bulge of all, more than 60% of the population under 30. They were educated in ways that their parents and their grandparents could only dream of. This is a tsunami of well-educated young Syrians. And they, for the first time, unlike their parents, could reach out to the world through the internet, through their smartphones. I have been in the smallest villages of Syria, and you can find an internet cafe. These were the people who were the vanguard of the revolution. These were the people who had finally decided that living under an authoritarian system with brutal instincts was no longer tolerable. These were the people who had cheered the revolutions in Cairo and in Tunisia, and a lot of them spent time online helping to organize what was happening in Cairo and Tunisia and learning how to do it. And what they learned, they brought to Syria. Social media was a way for them to create weekly demonstrations and create a civil society online for the first time in 40 years. And somehow they finally convinced their parents to join them. And if they couldn't, they would just sneak out at night. I met a young woman who was a banker, and that's what she did. She snuck out her window at night to go and demonstrate. She finally, I saw her in June of 2011, and she finally told her father, who had now decided that she was right, that the revolution was the right thing for Syria. And she helped him, and I see this a lot with young people in Syria, she helped him work on his Facebook page. Because he needed to know, what can I get arrested for? And she knew, and he didn't. And that has been the story in Syria since the beginning, this vanguard of young people leading the revolution. You know, in some ways, they have lost their prominence because this has turned into an armed conflict. And my fervent hope is that one day these people will come back to prominence again to fulfill their vision of a new Syria. On April 22nd, 2011, I wrote these words in a report for National Public Radio. In Syria, young social media activists are playing a major role in what began as a demand for reform and now seems to be a call for revolution. In some ways, that sentence is still the most important one that I wrote about the Syrian uprising, and it continues to be true even as a nonviolent revolt has evolved into a brutal civil war. I arrived in Beirut in March of 2011 to cover a story I couldn't get to. Syria was closed, Beirut was close. So my first story was a profile of a young activist, 27-year-old Rami Nahli. He was on the run. He was hiding in Beirut, Lebanon. He was trying to escape a prison sentence or worse, and I saw a short item about him in the Guardian newspaper, and I tracked him down. What Rami had done in Damascus is he had created a revolutionary Facebook page under an assumed name, Malath Omran, still up today. He had posted a very handsome picture. What he'd done is taken handsome pictures from all over the web and sort of created a face. So it was really a face of no one. But it was a very clever way to evade Syria's intelligence service. Except a few days after Nahli arrived in Beirut, the security police wrote on his Facebook wall, "Hello, Mr. Nahli, we got you." They'd figured out that Rami Nahli and Malath Omran were the same person, and they had finally got him. Well, exactly not quite, because Rami was already in Beirut. And he came as the first face of the revolution. There was an army of journalists in Beirut in March of 2011. All of our offices had said, "Can you cover the Syrian revolution?" And the answer was, "Yeah, I think so. We'll have to go to Beirut and we'll have to see." We all knew that we couldn't get into Syria. So we seized on Rami. He was a live one. He was the only revolutionary that we could get to. He worked from a sparsely furnished safe house with a TV clicker and a camera, which sat next to a full ashtray and a cold pot of tea. And his computer became a hub for protest videos, eyewitness accounts, Facebook postings, and the data from scores of Syrian human rights groups who were determined to document the names of the dead. Little did they know that they would have to document 60,000 names by the beginning of 2013. He also had connections to Arab satellite channels, and as more and more of us arrived, he was able to share the information coming out of Syria with us. What he said at the time is, we are playing two roles. First, to spread the news, which he certainly was doing. Then to influence the street, meaning a loop of information between us and the revolutionaries back in Syria. And he said, we're not leading at all, but we're trying to influence. And influence he did, not just on the streets of Damascus, but on the front page stories that were coming out back then from the New York Times, the Guardian, the Independent, and National Public Radio. I saw Rami a few weeks ago in Istanbul. He had to leave Beirut last year because the security police continued to look for him. He has applied and gotten asylum in the United States, and he actually works for Washington's U.S. Institute of Peace. But Rami is in despair these days about a revolution that seems hijacked by radicals, a Syrian president who is adamant that he will stay on, and a U.S. administration that seems paralyzed without a coherent policy about Syria. But back in those first few months in Beirut, there were 300 profiles of him across the globe because he was the only one outside of the country. He was also representing something that is still true to this day, and that is that the battle for Syria is on the battlefield, but it's also fought on social media sites, where both sides of the conflict are hacking, posting, uploading, YouTubing, spamming in this frenzied propaganda war. For the opposition, social media sites have become a way to extend their reach. They can organize and they can get their message out. It has also become a way for Syrian rebel brigades to raise money. This is how you can convince rich donors in the Gulf of your prowess on the battlefield. Every single brigade in Syria has a logo, has a theme song, and has a videographer on staff to make sure that every time they go into battle, those scenes are uploaded on YouTube with their signature on it so that they can convince people that they're the ones to back. They are as sophisticated as an NPR pledge drive. The Syrian government has responded by spending billions on software, most of it manufactured in the United States, maintained by a team of Italians who come in and out to make sure that it all works. What they are doing is tracking these media social sites. The regime is partnered with Iranian specialists who got very good during the uprising in that country in figuring out how to arrest activists by finding them through their social media sites. So what's happened is the conflict in Syria has morphed into a media war, not just in Syria, but in the region, between two opposing camps in the Middle East, the so-called moderate Arab states and what's called the resistance axis. So what you see and what we are missing and what your life would be like if you were a Middle Easterner watching all of this in Arabic is there are now more than a dozen Syrian opposition channels that broadcast videos from the field. What you get is the latest explosion, the latest bomb, the most popular rebel commander, and the activists. You have satellite channels that are financed by the Gulf states, Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. They're all supporting the uprising. On the other side, you have Syrian state media and private media, run by regime loyalists and by relatives of Bashar al-Assad. You have Iran's Press TV and Russia's Moscow Today. They're all broadcasting pro-Assad news coverage. And in Lebanon, you have Hezbollah's broadcasting arm, Al-Manar, that amplifies the regime's message. You have to think of Fox News versus MSNBC on steroids. Both sides also employ cyber warfare. The Syrian regime has spawned a group called the Syrian Electronic Army. And this is a group of young pro-regime technical wizards. And they have targeted Columbia University, Brad Pitt, Oprah Winfrey, Reuters news site, and Al Jazeera's homepage. Yes, I see the thought bubbles. Brad Pitt. Well, think about it. His wife, Angela Jolie, is a representative for UNHCR, and she has been to visit the refugees on the Turkish border. Now, my guess is that she doesn't have a Facebook page, and he does. So he got the punishment that actually they meant to give to her. Syrian activists have been so successful in building this narrative about revolt and freedom that I have seen over the last couple of months that outside observers, academics, people in government, feel somehow cheated by the emergence of radicals in the ranks of the Free Syrian Army. Jihadists? Salafists? Where do these guys come from? You know, in fact, they have been there all along. Many of them are Syrians. A few of them have come from the outside. But what's happened is that the coverage has broadened, not so much from the activists, but from international reporters. For the first time, there's been unrestricted coverage in rebel-held areas. We're allowed to go in. So much of the northern provinces, Aleppo and Idlib, although they are contested, we can get there. So what you're starting to see is actually a more complicated picture of Syria than we've had before. We now have reporters who are there. Yes, it is still a revolt for dignity and freedom, but it is also a fight that involves Islamic radicals. It has been almost since the beginning. Their numbers are growing, and that is because of a vacuum. But it is not a whole lot different than it was from day one. The Syrian crisis is far from over, because even if Assad falls, there's going to be a fight for control of the country. And it may be every bit as brutal as what's gone before. Some of the worst atrocities and massacres to date have been committed by armed Alawite thugs against unarmed or captive Sunnis. So there will be no surprise if there is a sectarian backlash. Syria has also fundamentally changed. The country's industries have been looted or destroyed, farmlands have been burned, housing stock is in ruins. World heritage sites have been burned to the ground. The forcibly displaced inside Syria is expected to get to 3 million people this year. So humanitarian engineers, start your engines. You have a place to go. Humanitarian organizations predict that 1 million Syrians will be refugees by the end of next year. So 2013 promises to be a year of a staggering humanitarian catastrophe. Unfortunately, I have no good news to report, but I hope that I've shed some light on the forces at work in the country and why the Arab Spring has become such a bitter winter in a historic place like Syria. I think that this crisis will haunt the region for years. The scale of the destruction has already inflicted on the society, and the physical infrastructure of the country will require tremendous effort. It's going to take social imagination, political vision, and leadership to heal Syria. The insurgency is clear and united on overthrowing the regime, but no one in the opposition has yet to come up with a coherent vision for what the country will be like after Bashar al-Assad is gone. And one word about Washington. Actions have consequences, and that's what we hear often from politicians in Washington. It's too complicated in Syria. It is in a strategic part of the country. We don't want to get involved with the Middle East again. But I have to say that inaction also has consequences. Thank you very much.